I'm very glad to be here, and I'm going to have to do something that I normally don't do, which is to, because my time is limited, I will kind of have to restrict myself to giving you an overview of how I see the war, its origins, how it's developed, and its significance for us, and where it's likely to go. And I will give you some evidence for my statements along the way, but in general, it's a complicated story. It requires a lot of background evidence and things like this. I'm very happy to address anything you would like me to in the Q&A. But in the interest of time, I will kind of just give you like my view as we go along. I will mention here and there some alternative explanations and things that we don't know about yet. But in general, just bear with me. It's going to be a bit telegraphic here. There's just too much ground to cover. All right, so let me start off with the causes of the war. Now, we in political scientists want to distinguish between what are considered long-term causes and short-term causes. Long-term means processes that create the environment in which conflict becomes possible. And then you have the trigger, something that for some reason the countries are unable to reach an agreement that can negotiate their differences without resorting to violence. And this would be the immediate causes of the war. So for the long-term causes, of course, the Russian and the Ukrainian views are most important. And here, because we're interested in how this affects us and what our role is in this, I'm going to give you also a little bit about what I consider the American kind of interest in this area and what we're concerned about. In the Russian view, there's three elements to it that we need to discuss: the security, the kind of what I call the imperialist motive, and the internal legitimation of the Putin regime. One of the prevalent kind of views of supporters of the Kremlin is that this war is driven by security concerns in Russia, and there's a couple of these. And the primary security concern has to do with threats to Russia emanating from the West. Of course, anybody who's ever looked at the map will know that access to Russia from the West, every country that's, every invader that's gone there this way, from Napoleon through to the Germans, in a couple of times the Germans, the Poles as well, they all go through just one spot. There's the European plateau, and it's this short corridor between the Baltic and the Carpathian Mountains. So as a result, and then once you get through this, it opens into these wide, indefensible steppes, basically, of Russia. It's very difficult to do anything there to stop invaders. So as a result, the argument goes, Russian security, it doesn't matter whether you're an empire, a Soviet regime, or whatever Putin's regime is, it's always the same. You need to push that border as far away as possible from this, which means controlling parts of Poland at the very least, and of course, Belarus and Ukraine. So that's been the story all along. Stalin had this story as well when they negotiated the post-war settlement with the victorious allies over Germany, where he asserted the necessity of control over Eastern Europe. So his version of the security belt was a bit more expansive. And of course, the other concern the Russians have always had is access to a warm water port. Sevastopol traditionally has been their only access to something like this on the Black Sea. And of course, this leads to conflicts with Turkey, because to get out of the Black Sea, you have to go through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. So there's the result, the constant Russian policy to gain access there and control the straits. So that's kind of the security view. And in this view, the problem from Moscow is the Western, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, is the eastward expansion of NATO. Right? And the prospect of NATO membership, which somehow is going to undermine the security of the Russians. Now, we can discuss at length why I think this is not a legitimate not actually a real cause, although it's discussed quite a bit. But at the end, I will give you some evidence why this is the case. In fact, some information came out today that very clearly suggests that this is not the real reason. But again, it is out there and it needs to be discussed. Now, the other cause is kind of an internal expansionist cause. When the collapse of the Soviet Union happened, there was a brief hope that Russia will somehow modernize and become democratic, but very soon very different narratives took hold among the Russian elites. And one thing we need to understand is people talk a whole lot about Putin this, Putin that, but Putin is just a representative of a very wide kind of widely held opinions among the Russian elites. where a lot of the discussion with Ukraine, about Ukraine in particular, but of the post-Soviet space in general, ranges from we need to assert our influence there to this is just ours. There's very little actually space for people discussing, well, they legitimately can exist as independent countries. And Putin is actually kind of, so to speak, a moderate in this space in his views. So this is what I call the imperialist view, and it ranges from the idea that Russia must rise from its knees, where it was put by the end of the Cold War with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It was, you know, the Gorbachev made a mistake. He's the big villain in the story. The West took advantage of them. They robbed the country, and now it has to rise from its knees and assert its rightful place in the sun. And now the question is how to do this. And of course, that means reasserting its influence or control, depending on who you ask, over its immediate neighbors. And this, as we shall see today, I will briefly mention, this has created a lot of problems. Russia, by the way, since 1991 has been at war that it started every single year of its existence. This is not a country that has lived in peace with its neighbors. And these are all these small wars that we tended to ignore, but they all had this kind of property that it creeping, the creeping reestablishment of Russian control. And so here you have things that range from outright conquest of everything that belonged to the Soviet Union at one point, to indirect control, what my colleague David Lake refers to indirect control, which is installing pro-Kremlin regimes and then deriving the benefits. And finally, there's the issue of internal legitimation of the regime. And in this case, this is the idea, again, that Putin has staked his legitimacy, his prestige, on him being kind of the restorer of this lost greatness. And we should not underestimate that to the extent to which this topic is kind of important to the Russians. The Russians are quite like the Americans in this respect. They tend to share this view that they're a unique nation with a unique purpose in humanity, and they have their specific place in history. So that's the Russian view. I happen to think that there's the middle one, there's especially the need to reassert control is in part because of security concerns, mostly because of the desire to restore the greatness and to shore up internal legitimacy is the reason for this war. From the Ukrainian view, again, there's three main issues. The first is security. And one thing we must understand about Ukraine is with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, that it was not clear that most of Ukrainians wanted a clear break with Russia. In fact, up until 2014, the evidence is that they didn't. There are, of course, very ardent nationalists in Western Ukraine, but Central and Eastern Ukraine was a totally different story. They kind of wanted to be left to their own devices, have friendly relations with Russia, and have their own country. But neither were they very keen on joining the West in some sense or escaping specifically the Russian sphere. And as a result, the elites in Ukraine kind of bifurcated. You had, so the Russian attempt to kind of keep Ukraine in its sphere of influence means providing the cheap energy, subsidized energy, lots of money there. They subsidized political parties, lots of politicians who were, on their side, so to speak. And so you had these elites in Ukraine, which became very rich very quickly, oligarchs, just like the Russian counterparts that were very dependent on Russian money. But you also had new emerging elites who wanted more, contacts with the West. This is where the markets were, the innovation is, the future is. And of course, you had parts in society that wanted the Western style liberties, democracy, and kind of wanted to escape the Soviet past. So this created for Ukraine a very difficult kind of schizophrenic policy. Euphemistically, people refer to it as multi-vector policy, but what really it means they were trying to have it both ways. Kind of be close with Russia and the West and derive benefits from both. And this did not really work great, but it sort of worked until it started breaking down. First time in the so-called Orange Revolution, which ended up with protests in the Maidan when Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Russian candidate, won, but was accused of fraud, electoral fraud. The courts took a look. They reran the election, and he lost, right? Then, of course, the reform movement actually failed, and a few years later, in 2010, he was legitimately reelected. And actually, what he did next is what caused the big break and the change in policy with Russia. So Ukraine was kind of threading the needle there. It was highly corrupt. It was mired in pretty bad attempts to develop. There was not really succeeding. And of course, then you had the conflict within Ukraine between these three parts. You have in the south and the east, kind of more pro-Russian, mostly Russian-speaking Ukrainians. In the west, where before the belonging to the Soviet Union, that part had never had anything to do with Russia, actually. There were very strident nationalists. Even back in the early 80s, when I lived there, I remember going to villages in Western Ukraine that would refuse to speak Russian to you. At the time, I just thought they were so old they didn't know Russian, but now I understood why that happened. So you had this, and the most kind of the attempts were to bridge this, and it was very, very difficult. So the reformers kind of promoted views to the West and the movement of Ukraine to the West, membership in the European Union, hopefully NATO, and of course the other ones was like, no, our path is with Russia. And where were we in all of this? Right? And this is very important to realize because there's a lot of kind of conspiracy theories about the United States meddling in all sorts of nefarious things, participating behind the scenes and pulling strings. Frankly, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we had just one or two main concerns. First is that Russia should not disintegrate into a multitude of ethnic states, and the reason for this was nuclear security. What is going to happen with all the nukes of the Soviet Union? Who's going to get them? Who's going to control them? It is better for us if one regime stays in place. We'll make a deal. We'll finance their collection in one place, control, and all things like this. And we invested a lot of money and effort into this. We propped actually the struggling Russian regime multiple times so they can get out of all sorts of economic troubles, despite them clearly taking a non-democratic kind of course very soon after. So that's number one. And of course, Ukraine, at the dissolution of the Soviet Union, was a nuclear state. So we had to, our interest there was to convince the Ukrainians to give up the nuclear weapons and also negotiate a deal with what to do with the Soviet fleet in the Black Sea. And the Ukrainians were very reluctant to give up the nuclear weapons. They were afraid that without them, they would have absolutely nothing if the Russians could ever attempt to conquer them. But in the end, the promise of economic development and the threat to not send them aid worked, and they agreed to give up the weapons, which they did. They negotiated the transfer of most of the Black Sea fleet to Russia, and they negotiated a deal with basing rights in Crimea. And so from our perspective, we did not have a particular interest in Ukraine being independent. Everybody's going to remember the so-called Chicken Kiev speech that President Bush gave at the time, urging them not to declare independence when the Soviet Union is falling apart. We did not have any particular interest in having any close relations. Basically, our concern was stable Russia, essentially. And of course, the other problem for us has always been European security, which we convinced ourselves that the Russians have now become a normal state and we will trade with them. They'll sell us all their stuff. We will invest there and everybody will be happy and this will take care of everything. Okay, so that's kind of to counter these ideas that we are there pulling strings and desiring disintegration or independence for Ukraine. This is actually not the case at all. And things, however, came to a head in 2014, right? And this is when finally this attempt to do this multi-vector policy of the various Ukrainian presidents, essentially this came to an end. It became untenable. Both the European Union, with whom they had an association agreement, and Russia, where Putin was pressing for a customs union, demanded that basically Kiev declare itself one way or the other. And they essentially went for the highest bidder. It's not that Yanukovych was particularly pro-Kremlin or anything like this. He went to the European Union, said, with the economy is crashing, we need a huge loan. How much are you going to give us? They said, no, you cannot have this. You first have to tell us what happens with the association agreement. He went to Moscow. And Putin said, you can have, I think it was $23 billion or something like this right now, and customs union, and everybody will be happy. So he declared with Moscow and withdrew Ukraine from the association agreement. Now, this immediately caused people in Kiev to come out to protest this because they started to detect a move of the government to seize power the way Lukashenko had, essentially became a dictator in Belarus. And this is where the Kiev regime made what appears to be a critical mistake. They decided to use force against the demonstrators. And when they did, more people showed up. So they just encouraged this. And in this turmoil, and this what's called the revolution of dignity, Euromaidan, the president got cold feet. And suddenly he departed for Russia. He cited threats to his life and he left. And of course, the government, then the remaining forces declared him, the throne vacant, so to speak, and appointed an interim government. Now, in this, the Russians moved very quickly. They had clearly made preparations and plans to seize parts of territory if something like this were to happen, if their preferred candidate is hounded out of town, and it looks like their policy of indirect control would fail. And so they activated them. What we saw in Crimea actually occurred in many parts of Ukraine. It occurred in Odessa, it occurred in Kharkiv, it occurred in places of Donbass where people, God knows from where, suddenly showed up, seized the administrative buildings, and started declaring for Russia and for independence, and having done referenda and all sorts like this. Now, in most other places, they were hounded out of town by the locals, out of town. That did not, of course, happen in Crimea, where they had the most time and the largest indigenous support for something like this. And in Donbass, in particular Donetsk and Luhansk, there were people who basically Russians who came there to organize this, and they also succeeded in establishing themselves in a few of the towns. And this then next to the next stage, which is the war in the Donbass, this 8-year low-level essentially conflict. The Ukrainians tried to reassert control with what they call the anti-terrorist operation. They botched it very badly, partly because their army was very bad at the time. There were a lot of officers and soldiers sympathetic to the Russian cause throughout. In 2014, part of the Ukrainian fleet actually defected to the Russians, along with their commanders. So they were unsuccessful. And because they were so inept initially, they were just, their military strategy was not very good. So this resulted in a lot of civilian casualties in Donbass. So usually people cite number 12,000 total killed over these 8 years. What you have to realize is that only about 2,000 of these are actually civilians. The rest are combatants on both sides. And the civilians were killed by both sides indiscriminately, essentially shelling each other with artillery for the first year and a half. After that, so the Ukrainians lost very badly. They lost 2 crucial battles, which required Putin to send actually Russian troops to do the job. He denied it for years. Just a few years ago, he finally admitted that the ones in Crimea were Russians, and the ones, of course, in Donbass, everybody knows there were Russian troops, regulars too. But the point is, the Ukrainians were forced into the ceasefire, which left part of the country under Russian control. And the Putin strategy then was clearly to keep the country destabilized until he can have a regime that favors him. So he had absolutely no interest in actually achieving a lasting any sort of stable peace or anything like this. He did not want these separatist movements to actually succeed and detach themselves or anything like this. The constant kind of sword, the wound there, and dragging on the Ukrainian economy was perfectly suitable for him because he could play peacemaker. It's not mine. It's an internal problem in Ukraine. I can come and kind of help stabilize if necessary. But he consistently refused to participate directly in the Minsk agreements or anything like this. He was there kind of to facilitate things. And so what's the problem? Well, the problem is by 2022, the strategy had failed. It became very clear. The last 2 years, the intensity of the conflict fell dramatically. I think there were on average about fewer than 20 people, civilians, who died in the last 2 or 3 years of the war. So clearly this was not working. They had found a way to essentially isolate the conflict and just freeze it there and not worry about it. The population of Donbass started to decrease dramatically. Some people, there was no investment, of course, from the Kiev government. There was no investment coming from Russia for the reasons I described. A lot of people left for Russia. A lot of people left for Ukraine. The economy basically tanked completely. That had been one of the richest regions in Ukraine before the war, and now it is one of the poorest. So the strategy was failing. And then this coupled with several other developments that essentially presented Putin with a closing window of an opportunity to do something about this. And this is, first of all, Ukraine was well on its way of continued integration with the West. It was clear that it's going to make the move to eventually become a member of the European Union. Democracy was consolidating. They ran successfully elections. President Zelensky came with huge support, and he's actually from the eastern part of the country. As a Russian speaker originally, he was seen kind of as the bridge that's going to unify them. He then actually failed pretty miserably as a president because of corruption and things like this. But initially, it seems that everything was going well. So the country is essentially slipping away from the Russian sphere of influence. He's not coming back. So here, what can you do? And this is the closing window of opportunity. There's a temporary weakness in the Ukrainian society. He still thought, they actually ran a lot of surveys, the FSB ran a lot of surveys, and they kind of detected that there's still kind of sentiment that Ukrainians will not fight if the Russians will come and things like this. There's the perceived weakness of the European Union because of Brexit, the perceived weakness of NATO because of the policies of President Trump. There was the internal discord in the United States. So basically, now is the time. This is it. They're going to slip away. And if I'm going to do something and hope that the West cannot help Ukraine, now is essentially the time. And I believe this explains the timing of this invasion. And very quickly here, could the US have prevented this war? The answer is no. We tried. There was nothing we could have done, but I'm going to return to this in Q&A if you're curious to know why. There was nothing we could have done to actually stop. So what was their plan? All right, so the war is coming. What's their plan? So I will give you what they call Plan A, Plan B, and what's happening right now, but please understand this is not Russian designations. I have no access to secret archives to know what they call their plans, or but they helps organize our thinking about the phases of the war. So the Plan A, which lasted from the beginning of the war in February until mid to late March, was very clear from the way they fought the war and the way they announced the beginning of the operation, the special operation. It was, we need to topple the government in Kiev, install a pro-Kremlin regime, then partition the country. And the partitioning would be, if you look at the map that I just showed you here, if you look at the map, take the eastern part of the country, so Kharkiv Oblast, Zaporozhye below it, Donetsk, of course, and Luhansk. This is the Donbass that most of which they already had control of. And then take the southern part, which is to the north of Crimea, all the way to Odessa, and essentially block access of whatever remains of Ukraine, block it from accessing the Black Sea. And there's several reasons for this. And actually, they're still operating goals right now. They actually haven't receded much from this part, the territorial gains. At least these 5 provinces they want to hold. And the reason, of course, is Luhansk and Donetsk. This is, the traditional kind of the reason that supposedly went in there, to protect the rights of Russian speakers there. The regions north of Crimea are very important because one thing the Ukrainians did after they lost Crimea, they cut off water access to Crimea, and basically the peninsula is turning into a desert right now. So they need to reestablish control with access to the river Dnieper there, which is a canal that the Ukrainians had blocked. Now it's open again because the Russians control it. So they definitely needed to gain access to this. And of course, Odessa is a huge port. And if they contain the south, clearly any remaining government in Kiev would have to make good friends with Moscow if they want to be able to export anything out of Ukraine that goes in a seaborne route. So the initial plans, they attacked from all directions. They attacked from Belarus and from Russia and from Crimea, the occupied territories. The idea was to topple the regime as quickly as possible, to gain as much of these territories, and at minimal casualties, minimal damage to the infrastructure. Of course, remember, they're trying to actually capture these territories and keep them. So that's the idea. And they were using overwhelming force and local collaborators. There's a lot of traitors. We're just going to be learning more and more about this, how deeply the Russian security services had managed to penetrate the Ukrainian government and the military. So what did we do here? We, of course, imposed massive economic sanctions that are ramping up over time. Actually, the most important of them are still not in effect. They will be coming into effect at the end of the year and early next year. The Biden administration led this international effort to isolate Russia. Western companies began to leave and things like this. And the main part here is that we must avoid a direct confrontation with the Russians at any cost. Well, almost at any cost. Essentially, there will be no direct involvement. The Russians, of course, believe that the effect of the sanctions, they will weather them. The West is not really going to stick together for this. Western unity will not hold. And enough countries will be there to help them circumvent the sanctions. The Iranians, in particular, had a lot of experience in that. And China and India were there ready to plug any gaps in their supply chain or demand for gas and oil. And eventually, the European dependence on Russian energy resources will carry the day. So that's the idea. We're going to do this. And we're going to win. The outcome of this was failure. So despite managing to conquer about 20% of the country, and as I pointed out, and without actually heavy fighting, it's mostly by treason, they were surprised by several things. The Kiev regime did not fold. The population rallied to the defense of its own country. The Ukrainian military, unlike 2014, turned out to be very effective, much to everybody's surprise. The US-led response was astonishingly well coordinated and bore fruits very quickly. And then throughout the world, there was a nearly universal condemnation of the invasion. Like even countries that are not friends of the US or the West could not bring themselves to support this. Even China and lukewarm remained very non-committal, very lukewarm. And the reasons for this failure now in retrospect are there are several unpredictable factors. The factor that Zelensky chose not to run when he had the choice. The fact that Biden turned out to be surprisingly effective in rallying NATO and the West, despite when earlier the attempts to get them through to them the warning that the Russian invasion is coming had fallen on deaf ears. This now worked. The fact that the populations in the West reacted so strongly surprised many. And the fact that I saw young people in Germany, yelling at the government that we need to arm and help the Ukrainians. You had Greens in Germany being the most pro-war party right now. This is absolutely astonishing to anybody who's tracked German politics. Some of the factors were difficult to predict, but still uncertain how they're going to end up. The Chinese response was much more muted than many people anticipated. They have not actually stepped in any, they have helped, but not nearly as much as apparently the Russians had hoped. And then they were predictable, but the factors given the data, but they were misread by the people doing the analyses. How would the Ukrainian military and society react? And in the Q&A, I'll give you some data from the surveys that the FSB, the Russian Security Service, had run in Ukraine on the eve of the invasion and how they misinterpreted the results of these surveys. It's actually quite funny. And then finally, the predictable but hidden factors, which is the thorough corruption and incompetence of the Russian military, which we can discuss at great length as well. So what's the result when this part fails? They don't give up. The result is we're still a great country with a strong military. We're going to win this. So they switch to what I call Plan B. And Plan B is the war of attrition. And this went on from April until basically the end of August. The idea here is to force so one of the original goals is now abandoned. The goal to topple the Kiev regime is basically now gone. They realized they could not do this. They will have to negotiate with him. So now the goal is to force that regime to give them all the conquests that they wanted in the first place. So Putin is still after the same 5 provinces and all this other stuff. It's just that they're no longer trying to kill Zelensky, at least for now. And what's the strategy for this? They're going to grind down the Ukrainians. Russia is much bigger, vast resources, huge superiority in artillery, in manpower. They have lots of planes, and they're going to succeed in doing this by breaking down civilian morale. And essentially, they're going to go in, conduct Russification policies in any of the conquered territories, run their fake referenda, and get them declared for Russia. The important thing here, and this is still true, surprisingly, even after this counteroffensive, and I can also explain why, Putin has not declared a full or even partial mobilization in Russia. In fact, he hasn't even declared a state of emergency, let alone a state of war. Russia is still to this day operating under peacetime law, which is creating a huge problem for their supply of troops and things like this. And I'll spend some time in the conclusion explaining why he's still doing this, even though he wants the mobilization, why he's very unlikely to actually do it. What did we do in this phase? We started to provide armaments very quickly. But you must realize that for the first 2 months, essentially, we were providing arms thinking that the Ukrainians will end up fighting a guerrilla warfare at some point. So we were very reluctant to give them any major weapons that are likely to be fall into Russian hands or that will not be useful to what guerrillas want. Only after we kind of convinced ourselves that, well, it looks like the military actually can survive this and do something, that we started deciding, okay, we can give them some more. But to this day, we're not giving them anything super advanced. I mean, it's very advanced compared to what they have, but not compared to what we have. So we've limited them to mostly the short-range weapons until recently, and we've given them a lot of economic and financial aid, and we participate in a lot of intelligence collection and sharing. And of course, the tightening of the sanctions, now we're at the 6th package, I believe. What did the Russians do with this war of attrition? They decided to hunker down and essentially outlast everybody. They're going to import substitute, the stuff that they can no longer get from the West. They initially, for the first 2 months, they had a massive windfall, essentially from selling energy products because the prices had gone through the roof. which helped the government mute the effect of sanctions at home and essentially keep the war as far as possible from Russian society, despite some of the industry seeing a nearly immediate decline. They tightened the media control, increased repression, and activated all their assets in the West to promote Kremlin's views. And God knows there's quite a few of these assets in Europe and some here. Okay, so what's the outcome for this by the end of August? Well, the outcome was partial success for the Russians, right? They managed to gain territory. Here on the map, in the red, you see the territories they managed to gain, essentially, by the end of August, compared to the one in kind of purple that they controlled at the beginning. This is about 25% of the country at this point that they managed to gain. And the tempo was very slow. They were suffering tremendous losses, but they were grinding on. And for all their bravery, the Ukrainians were just very valiantly retreating, very slowly, but retreating and retreating. And this did not look good. Now, from the other side, there were good signs, right? First of all, there were signs of deteriorating Russian morale among the troops already because of the heavy casualties and the bad supply. NATO, of course, started to enlarge with the addition of Finland and Sweden. The European Union offered candidacy status to Ukraine and Moldova. And the Russian Black Sea Fleet suffered a series of very humiliating and embarrassing defeats in the Black Sea, where they even lost their flagship, lost it to a country that doesn't even have a military fleet at this point. And of course, some other countries like Turkey, China, and even the Taliban in Afghanistan, they took advantage of this and they just started milking Russia dry. And I'm very happy to discuss what they've managed to so far get out of it, and they're going to get more of it. Because they started to essentially, they noticed the Russian isolation and weakness, and of course the prices for all their services went sky high because not much supply for those. All right, so what's happening here? The reasons for that outcome. First of all, one of the big reasons here that the Russians made such slow advances is that by all accounts, Putin is micromanaging the war. He's actually intervening in all sorts of operational decisions at a very low level, and this is to the detriment of the military efficiency. That is not to say that the military is led by some great minds. There's too many cronies there, too many people who are there through corruption, so they actually are not very good to begin with. Then they lost a lot of intelligence asset in Ukraine. The purge of agents in Ukraine has been very thorough, and they've ensnared thousands of people. There were at least several hundred right now who've already gone through trials with evidence and everything and convicted. So this essentially deprived the Russians of much of insight of what was going on. Then there was this fierce and very effective resistance by the ZSU. Here is the Ukrainian name for the Ukrainian Defense Force, the army, and the territorial defense, which slowed down and forced the Russians to grind in Mariupol, in Severodonetsk, and just give casualties until the Ukrainians elsewhere were building defenses. So the Russians, basically, the moment they managed to break through in one area, they'd go and find new defenses in the other area. It's very difficult. But every time the Russians would achieve local superiority, they'd push on. And as a result, it became clear in early August that both sides would need a breather, and they both started to stockpile forces. And everybody was starting to talk that Ukraine desperately needs a counteroffensive. You cannot win a war by losing it slowly. You need a counteroffensive. You need to do it. And at this point, the war entered what I call the phase 3, essentially, the Ukrainian counteroffensive. There was a big question who's going to make it first, whether the Russians, who are planning their best defense is offense, of course, or whether the Ukrainians will manage to do this. The goal, of course, for the Ukrainians here is shore up morale at home, show that they can actually beat the Russians in a battle, and shore up support in the West by showing them, yeah, you can send us the arms, we know what to do with them. And essentially liberate large areas and enter the fall of the winter with in a more tenable strategic position. The strategy they appear to have used, and this is a developing story, is they marshaled forces actually in the north and the south, and they kept Russia guessing which way the attack is going to come. And I remember I was reading Ukrainian and Russian channels at the time, and the cacophony of voices in predictions that the Ukrainians just threw in the informational space was astounding. Everybody had their own theory of where it's going to come. Clearly, in retrospect, there seems to have been a strategy to kind of totally confuse the Russians what's going to happen. And in the end, using intelligence provided by the US, they decided to hit the Russians in the north and the south, but mainly essentially hope for a breakthrough in the north, where the Russian defenses were the weakest, because they had detected that the Russians had decided that the main attack will go in the south and had moved a lot of forces there to the right bank of the Dnieper River. So when the counteroffensive started, both in the south and in the north, it was astoundingly successful. They used very modern tactics, very small, very mobile units, penetrating in depth, bypassing all the villages, not bothering to, stay and fight the Russians, created such confusion that when you read the Russian communications that, in the Telegram channels, they just don't know, they couldn't understand where the Ukrainians are coming from. They appear to be coming from all directions. There's confusion, who's shooting at us, where they come from, which way should we go? A lot of the commanders ran. The command structure fell apart. So as a result, the Russians just started abandoning positions, especially in a place like Izium, where it was clear that it may be surrounded and the Russians could be destroyed. So they ran, essentially abandoning multiple, lots of equipment there. Here we have already started. One reason for the success, of course, is the intelligence, but of course the other one is we have given them, the Ukrainians, the advanced weaponry, especially in the multiple warship system, the HIMARS, and we've given them training, and we're participating in part in the planning in this. But most importantly, the US administration finally committed to continuing help to Ukrainian victory, which means the Ukrainians now could actually plan ahead instead of worrying that tomorrow's support could dry, so we need to conserve all our forces and we cannot afford anything here or anything there. So now they could actually afford to go forward. The Russian response to this right now is utter confusion, right? They, and we'll talk about this if you want to. It's very interesting to see what's going on. It's going to have some dramatic effects in Russia. But they've increasingly now begun to depend on China. They went to North Korea and Iran to look for weapons. They have asked post-Soviet republics like Tajikistan to give them the Soviet-era munitions. They're in serious, serious trouble. Okay, so very quickly now to talk a little bit about the reasons. Again, the success here on the previous page, I gave you the map, so you can see in purple is the area that the Ukrainians managed to liberate in just less than a week. This area took the Russians months. The equivalent area is actually, this is bigger than what the Russians had conquered in the last 4.5 months of heavy fighting. But this here is the southern front around Kherson, where the Ukrainians have made more limited advances, but they're still moving even there. And there's quite a bit of information that the panic in the north has spread to the south as well. So we may see actually a breakthrough and a collapse in this front as well. So the only active still part of the front is the center, which is Bakhmut, Donetsk Oblast, where the Russians are still attacking, desperately trying to break through the Bakhmut defenses, which they've been trying for 2 months at this point, unsuccessful. All right, so the question is, what now? What's going to happen now? To my mind, Russia is in no position to regain control of Kharkiv without exposing Kherson. So you cannot go and reconquer the north without exposing yourself to an attack in the south. And that's a big problem. They have a very bad choice to make. The invincibility myth of the Russian military has now been thoroughly shattered. We already had seen it discredited with a retreat under Kiev, but this is something completely new. And so now the blame game is going to begin, it has already, began in Russia. Who's going to take the fall for this, right? And so the regime is in increasing peril just when the sanctions are taking hold. By the Russian estimates, the effect of the Russian sanctions is expected to start to be felt by the population in October. This is what they think is going to happen. And now October will come just when the population will start to reel from the sanctions. This is when this defeat comes. So does this mean we're close to peace? And the answer is no, I don't think so at all. And here's several problems that need to be discussed. First, the problem is the Russians. They cannot credibly promise the Ukrainians that any ceasefire is going to be final. So if the original demands are not met and they do not gain the territory that Putin had in mind, or at least a significant chunk of it, they cannot promise to stop, right? For this, the Russian army, for this to be credible, the Russian army has to leave Ukrainian territory. And the question is now, which Ukrainian territory? Does this mean the territory they occupied since February? Does this mean a return to the 1991 borders? Of course, the Ukrainians say it's 1991. The Russians say, no, we're not leaving anything, except where you defeated us and threw us out. So it's very difficult to see how this gets resolved. And I do not believe they can overcome this credibility problem while there are Russian troops in Ukraine. Think of our peace deal with North Vietnam when we left the North Vietnamese army on the territory of South Vietnam. A year and a half later, they come, show up, and hello, hello, and in a month they take down the government. That's exactly what the Ukrainians would expect the Russians to do. Putin personally is no longer trusted sufficiently by the Ukrainians or the West, and he needs some sort of gains to sell the outcome to the Russian population. So as a result, I think, specifically with Putin in power, nobody was going to trust the Russians to make any peace, which means Putin has to go. And how likely is this? Well, he's dying, but he's been dying for the last 10 years. So I'm not sure that itself is going to be the solution. The Ukrainian government also cannot promise to actually give away territory at this point. I firmly believe if Zelensky would try to sign any agreement giving away Ukrainian territory, he will be turned out of office and strung on the first pole. It doesn't matter how much they admire him right now, the Ukrainians will do this. The surveys show that 95% of the Ukrainian population is against any territorial concessions at this point. So this idea that if we can press the Ukrainian regime to negotiate, they'll do it, I don't think they can, and certainly not now after this success. And finally, we, the West, we cannot credibly promise to give up on the sanctions. I actually do not think the sanctions will fall fully, even if we have peace. And the reason here is the conviction that Russia cannot be trusted. For 30 years of appeasement, essentially, leaving them to their own devices, just buying stuff like them, allowing them to expand their influence in Europe, turning a blind eye to all their shenanigans in Asia and in their, around their borders, and they still attack. So from this perspective, it's like, what else could we have done to make them happy? And the answer is nothing. And so there's now raising voices that Russia basically needs to be contained. This means, I think, that the anti-Russian Western coalition is going to hold because of this. So what comes next? I think it is possible, not sure how likely, but it is possible that this Ukrainian counteroffensive is the turning point in the war. One possible course of action is that the Russian morale now collapses. The mobilization, if they attempt it, is going to fail. I just, yesterday, the people in the Russian parliament kind of started talking about the need for mobilization, and the Russian media sphere just erupted in indignation. It's like, what are you talking about? I thought everything was going fine. You go to war. I don't want to fight this. So if the Russians support the war because it hasn't come to them. But if the war comes to them in the sense, well, now you have to be mobilized and go to fight and die in it, it is very unlikely that they will go for this. And this is part of the reason that Putin, despite wanting to mobilize, has repeatedly postponed this. There's indication that they do have the plan. He's just afraid to put it in place because they cannot predict the effect it's going to have socially. This has also created factional infighting in the Kremlin. And, Putin is very unhappy with the army. The army blames Putin for throwing away their initial plan, which was to destroy the infrastructure and all these other things before invading. So there's a lot of finger pointing with the security services. Everybody is now trying to find the scapegoats. So with this, it could be, right, that the Kremlin, one faction gains power eventually and replaces Putin, or Putin retires voluntarily. So that's kind of an optimistic scenario. The less optimistic, of course, is that the Kremlin will find the scapegoats. It's unlikely to be the military, but it could be some advisors. They might find some traitors. The Russians traditionally always find traitors, even among the highest rank of power. They're not necessarily the people responsible for anything, but they look like they could be. He will survive through the winter, manage to mobilize for full-scale war, and hold out hoping the Western unity collapses, essentially in the war of attrition. They cannot, at this point, conquer Ukraine anymore. So it's going to be an attritional war at best for them. I think he's wrong here. I don't think the Western unity is going to collapse. So they're going to lose this, I think, even under this scenario, but it's going to be much longer and much more painful for everybody. The war could revert to one of attrition, where it's going to be really this contest of will and economic strength between Russia and Ukraine and the West. And you must understand, Ukraine is in terrible peril right now financially. And we can talk about this. The economy has collapsed by 30%, the GDP. Unemployment is 25%. They need a lot of help. But the thing is, the West has the resources, I think, to help. And as long as we hold it together, we'll get them through. And of course, the most likely scenario, I think, is that the Russian position on the front deteriorates further, especially in the south. Putin then steps down voluntarily and appoints a successor, or they appoint a successor. He's not going to get killed because, of course, the population still loves him and adores him, and it's going to be very dangerous for the elites to do anything like this.
YourDictionary.com. Population is the number of people or animals in a particular place.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, what?
Nothing. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. The successors then would extricate the war, most likely by conceding vast chunks of territory, conceding the Donbass for sure almost. I never really cared about this. And then trying to retain some sort of hold of Crimea, but perhaps I think eventually maybe they'll have to agree to some sort of international condominium over Crimea. That is kind of my thinking of what is likely to happen in the medium run. And so what is the significance? I want to conclude with this of the war. For Ukraine, clearly you have a new nation that just emerged in our very eyes. There was a lot of Ukrainians, talking about Ukraine. There were, versions of Ukraine which was very kind of centered on Ukrainian ethnicity, despite having a lot of minorities. This is all gone. Now you have Ukraine that is defined as basically everybody who took up arms to defend the country, and that includes everybody, basically. So it's very similar in my mind to Israel and how it was forged in the War of Independence in 48. And I think that it's very likely Ukrainian society is going to end up looking a lot like the Israeli society. There's a huge respect for the army, huge role for the army in civilian life, all sorts of things, because one thing they will have to do is maintain constant state of readiness to deter any future Russian aggression, right? Integration with the European Union is now almost certain. In fact, NATO now, I think, is an open question again. It is actually possible that now they will become a member of NATO, even though before the war, I think it would never have happened. And of course, this is going to be NATO's first line of defense now, together with Poland and the Baltics, which will shift kind of the center of gravity in terms of security from France and Germany toward Eastern Europe. However, as I mentioned, they do have very serious economic problem. The deficit, the projected deficit, is on the order of $3 billion per month over the next year. We just announced that we're going to suspend all the debtors, the Western creditors are going to allow Ukraine to suspend payments on an international debt until the end of 2023. That's good, but not enough. So they're going to have a difficult and costly recovery with a lot of role for the West and Turkey to help. What about Russia? I think for Russia, the outcome is a disaster, regardless of when the war ends. The economy will be pushed back at least 30, maybe 40 years, in many sectors even further back. It's going to be an international pariah for a long time. There's going to be massive unemployment and worsening social problems. I'm pretty sure Putin will not survive this as a ruler. And in fact, I think the entire regime might fall. And I have absolutely no idea whether, I said this back in March when they were still at the gates of Kiev, but I think there's a likelihood, there's a non-zero chance that the Russian Federation may actually disintegrate under pressure. There might be a war for succession. And here, Chechnya is a very important player with Kadyrov, who everybody seems to treat as a clown for the most part. He's not. And he's been playing his role here as Putin's big supporter very cleverly. But in fact, he's in the command of a 40,000 strong personal army that has not suffered casualties. He's kept it away from the fighting, actually, in Ukraine. And the question is, what exactly does he intend to do with this force? And we can talk about this as well. For us and the West and the world, this is a stress test for the European Union, for sure. After the departure of Britain, there's questions about its viability, but now surveys show that support for the European Union has risen in Europe. There's a significant decline of the far right and the nationalist forces. This European Union leadership seems to be determined to see this through, and the citizens seem to be resolved to have a cold and nasty winter without Russian gas if necessary, but they will do this. And of course, the analogy here that I have in mind is always the Berlin Airlift in 48, when the Russians tried to strangle the will of the Berliners, the West Berliners, by cutting off, imposing a blockade and cutting off supplies to them. And it didn't work. It backfired. And I think it's going to backfire now as well. NATO, of course, is expanded. It got revitalized. Suddenly it has a mission again. And it was strengthened. And all of this without a direct war with Russia. We also found out something that many of us had begun to doubt, which is we still have a lot of influence and friends around the world. And this is kind of very reassuring that we're not alone. The countries still coordinate on the US. We're still able to lead. And this is very, very important because that's a warning, as far as I'm concerned, to China about any kind of ideas that it could seize Taiwan by force. That if it hoped that the U.S. had declined, and this new world order that they and with the Russians have been building for the last 20 years has taken hold, they might actually see this as a grave disappointment. There's going to be a curtailment of Russian money and influence around the world. And of course, this means places like Turkey and Iran are going to start to matter again in many cases. People are looking now to Iran to start supplying oil when the Russian oil ceases to be available, things like this. And of course, the post-Soviet space we have to watch. We already have fighting breaking out between Armenia and Azerbaijan right now, started yesterday. Again, there's now massive protests in Yerevan, in the Armenian capital, against the government, which seems to be trying to negotiate some kind of concessions to Azerbaijan. They're abandoned, of course, by the Russians, who cannot come to help or do anything because they have their own problems, or they negotiated this with the Turks even before this, as some people say. There's fighting between the Tajiks and the Kyrgyz on the border right now that erupted the other day. Georgia, the main party, just is proposing a referendum to ask the Georgians if they want to open a second front against Russia so they can regain their lost territories. Kazakhstan, there are signs that it's going to withdraw from the security organization run by the Russians, and they're going to reorient itself toward China. So basically, the whole world there is moving, right? And I think we do need to start discussing the possibility that the Russian Federation may not actually survive this. And what are we going to do? The nuclear weapons are still going to be there. And there's going to be lots of conflict in the area with lots of very unsavory characters running around, with lots of weapons floating about. What are we going to do? We were not prepared for the collapse of the Soviet Union. We're going to be prepared for this. So with this, I'm going to end it here. It was a lot longer still. I thought I'd manage to do it in a shorter period of time, but hopefully we still have some time for Q&A.
Branislav, thank you very much. That was really wonderful. That was an extraordinary big topic, and you covered a huge range of things. I had a question, but I'm going to repress it. I'm going to go on to the Q&A. People are using chat as we requested. We have several questions in chat. If people would like to, I will read them to you. If people would like to use chat, that would be great. Or they can always use the raise question command, and I'll try to call on you. And that one's so sort of harder to read sometimes because we have a lot of people. But either way, Suzanne and I will try to manage this. So, Branislav, in the chat, there is one question that you alluded to, which is talk about Belarusia. What do you think is likely to happen with the Russians? Will they respond to Russian pressure? Will Russia try to use it? What do you think will happen with Belarusia?
So there's been a lot of speculation if Belarus will intervene directly on the part of the Russians. And the answer, it peaked at about 50-50 chance, I think, in July, and has since receded. So right now, I think the chances of Belarus intervening directly are practically zero. And of course, one reason is the Russians are losing. It's like really the bad time to be throwing your lot with that side. Yeah. But more importantly, the Belarusians, the army, they gave a lot of their ammunitions and a lot of their machinery to the Russians as replacements for the losses. Yeah. So they actually, it's not even clear if they have anything left. And they're quite afraid, by all accounts, they're quite afraid, the regular army, of actually dealing with the Ukrainians. They do not know the reliability of their own armed forces, whether they will in fact fight the Ukrainians, and a lot of them are afraid. There are about, by some accounts, about 20,000 Belarusians that volunteer already on the Russian side. So it's unclear that they can provide anything more than this. So I don't think there's going to be a direct intervention by Belarus.
Great. Another question is, what happens? What do you think the likelihood that Putin will use tactical nuclear weapons or worse? What is the probabilities of that? That's one of the scary. I think desperate situation, guys do terrible things. What do you think?
Yes. Well, he cannot. I mean, guys do terrible things. He cannot himself use nuclear weapons. He has to order their use. Yeah. And if he's about to lose, the likelihood that that order is followed, I think, is very low. But we don't need to rely on this. I think the likelihood is non-zero, but is very, very low. And it's not exactly clear why. There are some theories as to why the Russians suddenly receded, basically stopped threatening the use of nukes. That's what they're trying. They reverted now to try to use the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant as the kind of the nuclear blackmail instead of the nuclear weapons.
Why
there's several reasons. So one theory is that the U.S. had communicated privately to Putin that if they detect, we monitor constantly where the nukes are. So the moment they try to open any doors and get the nuclear warheads to put them on anything, we will know. They've basically said that the moment we see any movement in that direction, the theory is they're going to basically attack, not with nuclear weapons, attack his bunkers that we know where they are and we can bust them. So basically personally go after them and probably kill him. Whether this is true or not, I don't know, but it sounds plausible that they've coordinated a very direct, immediate response. Again, not by striking Russia with nuclear weapons or anything like this, but we do have enough pretty strong ones. So that's number one. And the number two is the fear that the order will not be followed. So if you give an order like this and it's not followed, you're dead. You have no other way to go at this point. Mm-hmm. So I think it is not very likely. I mean, their doctrine still is very defensive. It's, they're going to use it to defend the country from invasion. And I don't think anybody's going to go to Moscow anytime soon.
Yeah, I think I may have this wrong, but I have the sense that this one of the questions says that you seem to think there's more chances of Putin resigning than of others resigning. Is that a right read of what you said? And
yes,
so,
I don't think.
Why do you think that?
Well, I think killing him is first very difficult, although there were indications there were at least 2 attempts already. One in the spring and one just a few days ago. There was a huge brouhaha in Moscow that I saw footage from, people were shooting, nobody understood what was happening. And now that people claim that there was an attempt to blow up his car. It failed, but now they're conducting a search based figure out who leaked the route. Whether this is true or not, I don't know, but there definitely was a commotion in Moscow. And so something happened there. I think the chances of a plot against him succeeding is very small. I mean, him getting killed is also a very bad outcome because, again, as I pointed out, the Russians like him. A lot of the Russians, place to trust in him. So if he retires and says, I'm old, I'm sick, I can't do this, but here's this guy's going to handle it. The problem is, meaning if he does this, they're not going to kill him. So there's a credible promise by the elites to keep him alive. He can retire. But the problem is, I don't think there's any takers for the succession. Because right now, what you'll have to do is show up and explain why you lost the war and how you're going to now give up territories and make this peace with the Ukrainians and probably have to pay reparations and all sorts of things. And I think nobody wants that role. They want somebody to do it and then, get the power from them after they become very unpopular. Right. So I'm not sure how this is going to play out, frankly. I think a likelihood of a plot is very low. The guy killing over and dying, but there's always a possibility. But I would not count on it. That's why I think him stepping down is kind of, not a zero probability event. And I think it has to happen before any peace would be possible for the reasons that I, explained.
Yeah, although, I mean, if I might continue on that, it's costly for him to accept a peace. It would be costly to any successor to accept a peace. It seems like a terrible...
Oh, well, I mean, if you're in retirement, you can always publish articles, blasting the agreements that are concluded, because had you known this, you would never have allowed this guy to come back.
Right.
I mean, come on.
What do you think are the chances that Ukraine or that the crops sitting in Odessa and elsewhere will actually be able to continue to leave the Ukraine and get shipped out through the Black Sea? Are they going to let that keep going? And why are the Russians doing it, actually? Why are the Russians agreeing to that?
So that's a big question, and to me, the answer is a deal with Turkey that they made.
And why?
I think part of the deal,
go ahead.
Because I think Erdogan is playing peacemaker, and he's basically told Putin that he's going to get the Ukrainians to agree to a bunch of stuff. Turkey is emerging as a very major player, and he's any further disposition of the Black Sea is going to have to contend with them. I mean, look what's happening now with Armenia and Azerbaijan. You think that something like this happens without an agreement between Turkey and Russia? That Azerbaijan will suddenly wake up and start trying to conquer, break through a corridor to its exclave there without, knowing that the Russians will not respond. And the Turks came out with a very strong kind of line of support for Baku in this, unlike the US and many others who are pressing Azerbaijan to stop right now.
So what do the Turks get out of the export? I mean, they certainly make money.
They made tons of money. They're making
a lot of money. Right?
20% of its shipment goes to Turkey.
Yeah,
they made a whole lot of money, and they got, I think, the promise that the Russians will abandon the Armenians.
Yeah.
So that seems like a very solid deal, if you ask me. So yes, I think the grain shipments will continue, and not the least because the Russians may not actually have the capability to stop them anymore. I mean, they just had to move the submarines further out and keep them underwater because they're afraid of the Harpoon missiles. The country with no fleet is going to sink them. So,
it's hard to imagine them actually using the submarines against these ships. That would cause a scandal.
I would never underestimate what kind of stuff the Russians may actually do.
Yeah. Yes, your Philo-Russian. Yes. Anyway, let's not get down there. What about there's a question about the UN. What role do you think it has, if any role? Should the role of the Russia in the Security Council be altered? How likely is that could happen? Can the General Assembly exert any pressure on the Security Council, et cetera, et cetera? What do you think of all that?
Well, I think that this is a situation for which the UN has never meant to be, was never expected to be able to handle, frankly. Given its original composition with the permanent members and things like this, it has never been able to restrain one of these members, no matter what the identity of that member is.
No, you should explain that, though. You should explain why the UN does not work if one of the parties in the conflict is itself a member of the Security Council.
Yes, the Security Council has 5 permanent members, right? Who are the victors of, who are the winners in World War II and France for some reason. So it's sorry.
That's quite all right. That's quite all right. You can't resist that one. Yeah.
I just can't do it. The US, the UK, France, China, and used to be the Soviet Union, and of course now Russia was declared the successor. However, this is actually disputed whether Russia had the right to be declared the successor to the Soviet Union and take its seat as a permanent member, because originally the UN Charter was signed by Russia and Ukraine signatories separately. Right. So anyway, it's kind of a curiosity for lawyers to figure out. But these 5 permanent members, they have veto power on any decision. So to expect the UN to be able to coordinate on anything that affects any of their interests, it's never worked and it never will work, right? So if you want a different security structure, then the UN has to be reformed. The thing is, we, meaning the US, probably don't want this. I think we rather like our veto power in the UN Security Council. So it's unlikely to happen, I think. Now, if the Russian Federation falls apart, there's questions of succession, maybe the membership could be altered. But the idea that the whole UN could be revised, it will have to go over American, I think, opposition, actually. We don't like the UN, but they would like to have it in the way it's set up, I think.
Well, but I mean, let's push it for a second. The motive behind this question, I'm not sure. The motive behind this question is the way a revised UN could be more effective in peace management. Is that true? Would a revised UN be able to manage world affairs better?
Well, here we'll have to play a lot of inside baseball for me to explain my answer why I don't believe collective security works very well.
Okay.
But my answer is I don't think so, because I don't think collective security works very well.
Okay.
In fact, for us, right now, one of the reasons we want to support Ukraine now is because we do not want to test whether Article 5 of the NATO Charter, the Common Defense one, actually works. It's never been tested. Nobody knows whether it will work. And if we stop the conflict before it spreads to a NATO member, we don't have to find out and we can pretend it works, right? That's a big problem with any security arrangement like this. You know, if the Russians go and start shelling some villages in Latvia, are we actually going to go to war with them over this? Well, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to this, frankly. And neither does anybody.
Yeah.
Except maybe the people at NATO who have already planned what to do. From our perspective, you know, the threat that, we have this arrangement and we all talk about it and we're very committed to it. We hope that it works, but as I said, it's never been tested and we really, really don't want it tested, which is why stopping Russia and Ukraine is our best bet right.
What do you think of the Chechnya situation? Is this likely to increase as conflict or the?
So Chechnya, as I said, Kadyrov is Ramzan Kadyrov, who is the leader of Chechnya, is in a very anomalous position, right? Yeah. He has essentially a private army of about 40,000 troops. It's very well paid. It's very loyal to him. Recently, they made it a part of the Russian National Guard, but it still answers to Kadyrov. They have a lot of privileges. They can go around in Moscow and St. Petersburg, where they have headquarters, parade around with, guns and do all sorts of nasty stuff. So he's been shooting a lot of videos in Ukraine, but his troops are never in the front line, right? So he's not basically any losses. He has forced and mobilized Chechens, young Chechens, about several thousand of them, that he threw into the meat grinder in Ukraine. But he doesn't care about this. In fact, these are potential troublemakers that he's probably happy to see go. So the question is, why is like this? I mean, nominally, Russia won the Second Chechen War. But the arrangement, if you look at it, looks a lot of Putin is paying tribute to Chechnya to stay in Russia and not cause trouble. He's allowed him to do stuff that nobody else can. Now, Kadyrov is roundly hated by all other power elites. The FSB, the military, they can't stand him. They would have killed him the moment they could lay their hands on him. So his well-being is entirely dependent on Putin, which is why he's so loyal. So the question is, what happens to him if Putin is to go, either killed or retires or dies in illness? And there's, as far as I can say, three possibilities for Kadyrov. And I think the last one is actually the most interesting. The first one, being the only actually organized military force right now, we've just destroyed, the Ukrainians just destroyed basically the tank brigade that usually serves to cover Moscow and is used to quell rebellions and things like this. So for internal security, it's all gone in Ukraine. The military has almost no assets left in Moscow. So if anybody tries to take force by power, power by force, it's not clear that they actually can stop them. And Kadyrov has this. So one possibility, and people seriously talk about it, is that he could be Putin's successor. Now, I think that's unlikely because so many hate them. If they even sniff out that this is a possibility, they're going to try to kill him immediately. The second possibility is that whoever is the successor, like Patrushev or Patrushev's son or some of these people whose name have been floated around, then they will need his support to take power. So they have to bribe him, and essentially he'll become their, bodyguard, and the new ruler will be his protector again. So he'll continue in the same role, lording all over in Chechnya. Now the third one, and that's the interesting one, it was prompted, like I had the speculation just today, actually, I wrote a blog post on this, is that Kadyrov recently installed anti-aircraft systems in Chechnya. And it's not at all clear to me why he needs this. It's not like the Ukrainians are going to go and attack Chechnya. Who is he going to be defending against? Right? Well, one possibility is Russia. I mean, one play that he could make, if Putin is sufficiently weak and he can do it, he suddenly declared that he's all for Chechen independence. It's all been a ploy, and he's going to have the force, and that's it, and we're going independent. And nobody in Russia can stop him right now. And then this will weaken all the force. The people in Chechnya generally hate him because, of what he did and how he turned cold, and given his history. But if he's going to lead and create the new Ichkeria, I mean, who's going to exactly resist him there? So that's one very interesting play. If he does this, I mean, this is the beginning of the end of the Russian Federation, because others will probably follow. So that's my, speculative take on Kadyrov, the possibility.
Let me put a final question, because I think we are close to running out of time if I look at my clock properly, which is, what is the evidence about Putin's health? Is this all speculation? Do we know anything? It
is very speculative. Insiders claim that he has some sort of cancer. They're always looking at the way he moves his arms and things like this. There's also people claiming that you can't actually infer anything from this because he has body double, so you never know which the real Putin is. Nobody knows, and I would not speculate. He has basically among the best doctors in the world and the best healthcare. They're going to keep running this guy long after most normal people are dead, I think. Like, I would not build a policy based on him dying anytime soon. I mean, it'd be very convenient if he did, but who knows? There is some problem, for sure. There is some problem. He looks tired. He cancels a lot of meetings, especially recently, and things like this. So there's something going on.
Well, he's got a few problems. Do you think there's any limits? I was reading an article that the U.S. was reluctant to give its full technology to the Ukrainians because it wasn't sure what would happen to them and all that. Are we, in fact, increasing the quality and the level of the technology that we're giving to them now?
My impression is yes, although we're still not giving them the highest, the most recent stuff. In fact, we had to modify some of the arms that we're sending them to remove the recent upgrades to make sure they don't quite get them. And again, the fear is they will fall into Russian hands, or they will leak, because they're still, I mean, the Ukrainians have not plugged in all their leaks there. They've done a remarkable job, but who the heck knows what other assets the Russians still have there in their security services and the military.
Right. I mean, are you optimistic that there isn't going to be another reversal, that the Russians won't mobilize, and they are used to the long haul. They could. What about the scenario of Putin slowly mobilizing the authority, getting the numbers on his side and moving slowly back in? Possible? No.
Yeah, the problem is not that you cannot mobilize. Like, you can always find people. I mean, even right now, they actually can find people willing to go there for 200,000 rubles, what they're promising. The problem is they're not trained. They have a severe shortage of young officers, and that is a very big problem on the battlefield.
Right.
And they can't replace these easily. Just the other day, they announced that the military schools are going to let out their senior class early so I can use these as officers. I mean, come on, you look at them, poor guys in their early 20s, they've never commanded anything in real life. What exactly military value do we think these guys have? So, and what are you're going to arm them with? You're already scrounging your allies for Soviet-era weaponry. Like, you're going to send them to the front and what? With slingshots or something? I mean, they're in serious trouble. Like, yes, it's a lot of manpower, but a mobilization. The information I have is that the internal report they had in the spring about mobilization said that if they're going to mobilize, they have to complete it by July 15th. After that, its effectiveness will be zero, basically, for the war. And clearly, this deadline has long passed, right? Anything they bring in now won't be available until mid-spring next year.
Yeah.
It's too long.
Branislav, that was fantastic. For those of you who want to read more, I strongly recommend Branislav has put up Slantchev, which is his last name, slantchev.org, and you can get long written versions of some of the things he's been saying.
Very long.
Which he posts. Every so often, he's motivated to post one of these. I don't know how he does.